Now, we didn't get very far in lesson 4, but I'm not worried about that because this is very important. We can make up a bit of time later on, but we do need to look very carefully at this idea of the law because we'll constantly be coming back to it and looking at it. But what does the law say about atonement? This is page 2 of lesson 4. First of all, of course, we're looking at the sacrificial system of it because we saw that that's where atonement is provided, and particularly in the sacrificial system where the matter of sin is dealt with. And so naturally when we come to the law, we say, where will atonement be next? How will it fit into the law? And we look for the sin offering. And of course, it's there in the sin offering. And that's the next step that we'll look at, where atonement is incorporated into the law. Now, in every doctrine, as we come to the law, we'll find every doctrine incorporated in the law, and we'll find it quite easy once we look through. We'll come across it and say, oh yes, that fits with atonement, or that fits with redemption, or whatever. And so we need to look at the sacrificial system and see that as instituted in Genesis 3:21, right now, that's where the sacrificial system was put together by God in the first place. God was the first priest that offered the first sacrifice. And so we saw it there, and then we saw it up to to Noah, and so the flood was 1,560 years after Adam, and then we've gone on now another 500 odd years or more, and nothing has been taken away from Genesis 3:21. Now, understand this. This is how progression works, right? This is how the doctrine of progression goes. Nothing is taken away, but gradually things have been revealed to add to our understanding. There's a progression going on. Now, I want us to understand this. People will say to me, oh, look, God put it together in Genesis 3:21, and now you're saying this is added to it and this is added to it. Of course it is, because doctrinal progression requires added information as we go along. And so if we want to know about a doctrine, God doesn't go, clunk, there it is in one verse. He gives us that verse, and then we work that out and we get it established in our mind and clear, and then he adds to it. Now, nothing that he adds takes away in any way from what's been given us as we go along. God is immutable. He doesn't change, and so he puts the principle in place and then he adds information to it, but he takes nothing away. So gradually things have been revealed which add to our understanding, and this will keep going right until we see it fulfilled in Christ. Now, at the time of the giving of the law, naturally the sin offering, which has always been the atoning sacrifice right back to Genesis 3:21, is incorporated into the law. And we find it incorporated into the law in Exodus 29. Exodus chapter 29. Now, it's a long chapter, and I'm only going to pick out for you the things that have to do with the sin offering, right? And there are other offerings and other things there, but I want you to understand this chapter is about atonement. In fact, we have Exodus 29:33 is the first usage of this actual word atonement. And it's looking back at this chapter that we're going to look at, the sin offering, and saying that atonement has been achieved through the substitutionary sacrifices. It confirms exactly what we've said all along, that the substitutionary sacrifices provide atonement. Now, they provide a covering for sin. Now, we knew that this was so back in Genesis 3:21. It's not changing anything. It's just confirming what we already knew, that the principle that it is possible for sin to be covered is indeed true, and it's saying here, yes, that is actually so. So let's look at the law as we see it in Exodus 29. In verse 1, and I'll just read it, and this is the thing that thou shalt do unto them, this is unto the priests, to minister unto me in the priest's office. And here's a sin offering we're going to have now for the priesthood. Take 1 young bullock and 2 rams without blemish. So a young bull is taken. Now, here's something that is a technical thing, but you probably need to know this right from the start. When it says, take 1 young bullock and 2 rams without blemish. Now, 1 young bullock, we say, what's a bullock? Well, we say that it's a male of a cattle, like cows, but it's a male that has been castrated. And that's a bullock. And if you look up your dictionary, it'll tell you that that's what a bullock is. However, that's not what it's saying here. It's saying a young bull. Now, it's not a bullock. If it had been castrated, it wouldn't be fit. It would have a blemish. And so we need to understand that this is a bull. A young bull is taken. It can also be a kid of the goats or a ram, but either way it has to be entire and it has to be a male, right? So a bullock is taken. Now, in the process of this chapter, it telling us what's going to happen with the priesthood, and we get back to verse 10, and it's talking about the bullock again. And thou shalt cause a bullock to be brought, this is a bull, to be brought before the tabernacle of the congregation, and Aaron and his sons shall put their hands upon the head of the bullock. Right, the bullock is taken before the tabernacle, before the presence of God. And Aaron and his sons, verse 10, the priests, put their hands on the bull's head. Now, what are they doing that for? Well, this is to confess the sin of the people and their own sin, and to impute the sin of the people to the sacrificial animal. They put their hands on the head of the bull, and they confess their own sins, and they confess the sins of the people, and in type, these are put on the head of the animal, right, the sacrificial animal. And verse 11, and thou shalt kill the bullock before the Lord by the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. So verse 11, they kill the bullock. And how do they kill it? It says in verse 12, and this is interesting, they say that it says just they'll kill it. And so we say, oh, is the blood necessary? Remember we asked this question back in Genesis 3:21. It didn't specifically say that God shed the blood. But here it says they'll kill the bullock, and so we say, oh, so does the blood matter? Right. And verse 12, and thou shalt take of the blood of the bullock and put it upon the horns of the altar with thy finger, and pour all the blood beside the bottom of the altar. Now this tells us a great deal. It's the blood of the bullock is taken, right? Its blood's taken. the priest with his finger puts the blood on the horns of the altar, and then he pours all the blood out beside the bottom of the altar. What does that tell us about how they killed the bullock? Well, it tells us this: they cut its throat and they bled it, and they took all the blood and poured it out beside the bottom of the altar, right? And so when the sacrifice is made, the blood, now we see quite clearly that without that blood being shed, there's going to be no atonement. And the sin offering makes this perfectly clear to us. We look back to Genesis 3:21, and we're beginning to realise now what we're going to find out more and more. Without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sin and no atonement for sin. And we look back and we say to ourselves, now, was the blood shed back in Genesis 3:21? Well, were they covered? Yes, they were covered. And so we know atonement was made. So if atonement was made and there's no remission of sin without the shedding of blood, then we know that back there in Genesis 3:21 that God did shed the blood. This is the progression of the doctrine. We get to this point, we look at the sin offering, we see the importance of the blood, and we can look back and say, well, God doesn't change, so he must have shed the blood back in Genesis 3:21, and we can be quite sure we got that right. Then in verse 13 it tells us, and thou shalt take all the fat of that covereth the inwards, and the caul that is above the liver, and the 2 kidneys, and the fat that is upon them, and burn them upon the altar. Right? So the blood's taken, the priest with his finger puts the blood on the horns of the altar, he then pours all the blood out beside the bottom of the altar, he then takes the fat from inside the bullock with the 2 kidneys, and he burns it all on the altar. And then this is very important. But the flesh of the bullock and his skin and his dung shalt thou burn with fire without the camp. It is a sin offering. Now, I want you to get that really clear in your mind. Mark it in your Bible, that verse, right? Everything that remains of the bullock is then taken out of the camp and burned outside the camp. It is a sin offering. Now, why did he add that bit? It says, but the flesh of the bullock and his skin and his dung shalt thou burn with fire without the camp. It is a sin offering. Now, why did he put that bit in? Well, what he's saying is, this is what typifies the sin offering. This is what tells you that it's a sin offering and not a peace offering or a burnt offering or any of those things. What's he talking about? Well, a sin offering is taken without the camp, outside the camp, and is burnt. And that's the unique thing about the sin offering. When we look at an offering and it's taken outside the camp and burnt, we know that that's what makes it a sin offering. That's the unique thing about the sin offering. Other offerings are burnt on the brazen altar where they're killed, but not the sin offering. It's taken outside the camp. None of it is eaten and nothing remains. So there you are. That tells us about the sin offering. And you say, oh, well, that's fairly simple. I can learn that. They take a young bull and it's taken before the tabernacle. Aaron and his sons put their hands on the bull's head and confess the sins of the people and impute them to the animal. They kill the bullock, its blood is taken, the priest puts it with his finger on the horns of the altar, and then he pours all the rest of the blood at the bottom of the altar. He then takes the fat from inside the bullock with the 2 kidneys and he burns it on the altar. Everything else is taken outside the camp and burnt. None of it is eaten and nothing remains. And we say, all right, well, that's the sin offering under the law. So when people wanted to deal with their sin, when people of the children of Israel wanted atonement for their sin, they knew they were sinners, the law told them that. And they went to Mr. Law and said, what do I do about sin? And he says, well, Mr. Grace, you need to go to, you need atonement. And they said, how do we get atonement? And he said, well, offer the sin offering. Now, we see, of course, that they had to do this all the time, every time they sinned or every time they realised they were sinners. And so they did it offerings often, all the time, regularly. And so that tells us something straight away. It tells us that this sin offering, though it was atoned for their sin in that sense, it wasn't the permanent answer to sin because they had to keep doing it. And they did it over and over and over and over. And we saw that it was never going to permanently deal with sin. But it set down the ground rules for atonement to be made in such a way that it permanently dealt with sin forever. Right, so we see that the sin offering takes the sin of the people as confessed and imputed by the priests and bears their sin in its own body. Its blood is shed, that's the life, in its substitutionary death. It's instead of the people, it's in their place. And so it satisfies God's judgment of Genesis 3:3. What does Genesis 3:3 say? Let's go back and have a look at Genesis 3:3. Genesis 3:3. But the fruit of the tree which was in the midst of the garden, God hath said, ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. Right. So the sin offering gives its life and its blood is shed in their place, and so it dies. It satisfies the judgment of Genesis 3:3. The blood is poured out before God, leaving no doubt that the price has been paid in full. The blood being poured out is the guarantee that the life has been given. The fat and the kidneys, which are God's part of every animal sacrifice, are burnt before the Lord. The whole of the rest of the sacrificial animal, still carrying the sins of the people, is taken outside the camp and burnt. It's a sin offering. Thus the sins of the congregation are taken away, right, to where they can be found no longer. Sin has been punished by fire, and God's righteous judgment has been satisfied. This is a type or shadow of Christ, who is our sin offering, and this is a major part of atonement, the doctrine, as it is instituted in the law. But there is more. God decreed that on the 10th day of the 7th month each year there would be a day of atonement. And we talked about this before. Yom Kippur. Yom is day. Kippur, we know, is atonement, because we saw that in our first lecture. So there would be a day of atonement. On this day, the sin offering for the whole congregation would take place, and the sin problem of the people would be dealt with. Now, we're going to deal with this Day of Atonement. We're going to lead up to that. We're not going to do it just yet, but we're going to deal with it. We understand, of course, that this day, like the sin offering itself, was only a type or a shadow. If it had been otherwise, it would not have to be repeated year after year, right? God decreed that on the 10th day of the 7th month, every year, there was going to be a day of atonement. There was going to be a day when sin was to be covered for the whole congregation, right? Now, sin offering, the ordinary sin offering, anyone could bring a sin offering. The priests had to bring it for themselves. The people had to bring it for themselves. There were sin offerings offered every day throughout the tribes of Israel. But once a year, on the 10th day of the 7th month, God said, we're going to have a day when we look at this